Welcome to the Religion Media Centre Zoom media briefing this week, where we're going to be talking about a new movement to rename the study of religion, both in schools and universities, to rename it and rethink it as worldviews. We're going to be joined a bit later by Professor Douglas Davis from the University of Durham, who's bringing out a book on worldviews called Worldview Religious Studies. And joining us in the panel to discuss it, we have Dr. Katherine Wright, the CEO of Culham St Gabriel's Trust, Deborah Weston, the chair of the policy unit of the RE Council, and Dr. Tim Hutchinson from the University of Nottingham, who's a member of our advisory board here at the RMC, to discuss those ideas. So this could get very abstract, this conversation, but I wonder if we could just root it in what's going on in the classroom and turn to you, Katherine, first of all, from the perspective of the Culham St Gabriel's Trust. Can you just tell us what is being taught in schools at the moment? What does religious education mean?
Okay, Ruth, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. Okay, well, that's a really good question, isn't it? Because the answer, probably the honest answer is we're not entirely sure. We know from surveys that the National Association of Teachers of RE have conducted that what actually happens in the classroom in religious education is hugely variable and can be very inconsistent. We also know that there are different syllabuses in each local authority and in some academy trusts as well, and in dioceses and so on, which are asking children and young people to study different things. And that could be a real positive as well. So we're not entirely sure. However, I have a nice little summary for you of what I think RE should be doing in schools. And we used this little summary on a survey that we commissioned through Savanta Comres earlier last year. And we use this with the general public to describe what religious education is. So I'm actually just going to read it out. So religious education must be taught in all state-funded schools. Pupils develop knowledge and understanding of religious and non-religious traditions, including their diversity and impact on individuals, communities, and society. Pupils learn about the different ways in which people study these traditions, as well as building an awareness of and reflecting on their own personal worldview. And that description is taken, or it's kind of based on the Ofsted Research Review that some people will be aware of, which was also published last year. So we've kind of summarised that right down. So I suppose in answer to your question, that's what I hope is going on. But what's actually going on, I think, is much more variable. And as I've mentioned, the NATRE surveys and so on, but also we know that from some of the Ofsted reports that have come through as well, that provision is variable.
Thank you. And perhaps this is a good point to bring in Deborah Weston. Deborah, you're chair of the policy unit for the RE Council. This week you had, or last week, you had a meeting in the Commons where you were discussing various common concerns about the teaching of RE in schools. Do you think that changing the way that it's framed into worldviews would force schools to take religion more seriously in the curriculum?
I should start by saying that the RE Policy Unit is actually a partnership between three organisations. The RE Council is one of them, and the National Association of Teachers of RE and RE Today Services are the other two. So it's a partnership effort to try and strengthen the position of religious education in schools. Yes, we did have a Commons briefing, Commons roundtable, and very successful it was too. We have some really good response from parliamentarians across the parties, chaired by Sir Peter Bottomley. So that was a really good opportunity for us to share our concerns about religious education. We've talked about the sort of training of teachers, haven't we? And the fact that there's a real need to do something about particularly primary education. So 0 to 3 hours is the average of what they get to train teach RE. And of course, that leads to little confidence. And even in secondary schools, so many non-specialists, but trying to teach the subject. But that's not a reason to hold back progress. I think, when faced with a similar problem, what the government did was they commissioned a national plan for music when they faced these problems with music, and that's had a massive effect. So I don't think the fact that the training of teachers is inadequate at the moment in many places should mean that we don't move forward with what we think is a really good plan for extending RE.
What would the national plan for RE look like?
Well, if you look at the national plan for music, I think we'd be looking for similar things to that. But of course, getting the agreement for the funding of a national plan has got to be the first step, the principle of a national plan. And then lots of negotiation and consultation would need to take place about the contents. But at the heart of it, training, I think is a really key part.
So the plan would be the approach to the subject, but also would it set out a curriculum that all schools should follow as well?
Not necessarily. I mean, that would have to be something that would be discussed and debated. With music, what they've gone for is a model curriculum, which is not statutory, but actually provides some guidance on what high quality music education might look like. And we've been doing some work on that kind of thing as well.
And from your experience, Deborah, can I just ask you about the training of teachers in secondary schools as they go up to the age of 18 and then think about going on to university? Could you and Katherine just explain to us something about the curriculum for GCSE and A-level that a student may follow as they prepare to study religious studies or theology at university?
So GCSE was reformed relatively recently, and A-level, and it was altered so that GCSE includes the study specifically of 2 different religions, whereas in the past there were all sorts of variations that you could study. One of the other big changes at GCSE was to include much more diversity in the study of different religions. So diversity within religions. So for the first time, more detailed material was there for Sunni and Shia, for different branches of Judaism, Buddhism, and so on. So that was a really big change. And then when they go up to A-level, again, they can continue their study of specific religions as well as philosophical and ethical worldviews. And that has been quite popular, and I think contributed to the fact that we've held numbers, if you like, at A-level, despite the big reforms that have taken place.
Katherine, the same question to you. Presumably the different exam boards have a wide variety of different courses that students can study.
Yes, this is not my particular area of expertise. Deborah is far more au fait with this than I am. But perhaps I'd also just add that I think the question around diversity is a really important one. And I think we might later talk about this possible shift in terms of thinking about worldviews in particular. In light of Douglas's book, but I think there's already a move towards that, and I think Deborah's right. The inclusion of that more diversity, internal diversity, if you like, has been particularly significant, particularly at GCSE. But I think we would welcome more. Well, I would welcome more within that as well, and also lower down as well, because it's not just about the GCSE and A-level. Of course, you've got to prepare students to think about the concept of diversity from a really young age, I think, and just acknowledging that actually things are not there isn't one particular set way of thinking about something within a particular but particularly within a religious organized worldview, for example.
Thank you. So moving to you, Dr. Tim Hutchins at Nottingham University, when students come to you at the age of 18, what are they expecting to study?
So for a long time, I think universities have been trying to catch up with what we think the A-level is about. So we've been trying to teach students some version of religion, philosophy, and ethics, something that brings together religious studies with philosophy of religion. So that's one reason why I'm really interested in this new shift towards teaching religion and worldviews in schools, because history shows us in a few years we're going to have students coming in saying, I loved the modules about worldviews that I did at school. Where's the worldviews education at my university? And we need to, that will be the new frontier on which universities are competing. That would be one way of looking at it. Will be just as we are now trying to produce courses which are as attractive as possible to students who think they've got an A-level in philosophy of religion. Well, maybe the next thing will be developing courses that look like the most attractive study of religion and worldviews in the country. I think students come to university often uncertain or not yet exposed to the range of disciplines and approaches that we teach in theology and religious studies. Often very familiar with some parts of the curriculum, very unfamiliar with others. They might not have spent a lot of time, for example, learning about the Hebrew Bible or biblical studies, or they might not have spent a lot of time on many of the different religious traditions that you can understand at university. They might not have done very much sociology of religion, which is what I often teach. So we spend a lot of time in our first year of a university degree really explaining to students what it is that they can do now they're at university and all of the different approaches they can bring to the subject.
Can I ask you as well? I mean, it's moved away, presumably, it's light years away from biblical studies, is it? Religious studies and theology at university isn't centered on the Christian faith anymore.
Well, that depends where you study. So biblical studies is not Sunday school. And Sunday school is obviously a perfectly respectable thing to do if you're a Christian kid going to church. But biblical studies is a serious and difficult academic subject, like all of the others that we tackle in theology and religious studies. So many universities, and mine is one of them, University of Nottingham, has specialists who do New Testament studies. There'll be another specialist who does Hebrew Bible studies. There'll be someone who teaches you Hebrew. There's someone who teaches you Greek. And for a lot of students, that's really exciting. That's very new to them. But of course, we also have specialists in different methods. So you might have specialists in sociology of religion, or religion and media, or religion and politics, different religious traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, there are lots. So yes, so as you say, it's a really broad subject. But one thing that I hope we'll keep sight of in theology and religious studies is like that things like biblical studies still have a place in the modern university. They're still really interesting and vibrant and changing fields.
Can you tell us some more about the way that religious studies is often used as a subsidiary subject or as a joint honours degree? That seems to be an area that's grown in recent years.
Yes, absolutely. So this is true, I think, in a lot of areas of university life. It seems like students are more and more interested in joint honours subjects. But theology and religious studies is one of those areas where more and more students are now hoping to take this combined with something else, often philosophy. But at different universities, you may be able to combine a bit of theology or a bit of religious studies with something else like politics or some other discipline. And that's interesting, I think. A lot of students want to know about theology and religious studies, but they want to do that as part of a bigger degree. We also find lots of students from all across the university come in to take maybe one or two modules in theology and religious studies. So at the moment, for example, I'm teaching a class on religion, media, and ethics. And every year we have students signing up for that from the sciences, from engineering, from business, from philosophy, from history maybe. A really wide range of students from all across the university actually recognize that a bit of religious studies is a really useful thing to get.
Can you talk us through the way that departments are described in different ways? So some are theology, some are religious studies, some are combined. What's the politics behind that?
It's usually complicated and I think quite confusing for applicants. So this is something that, as you probably know, there was a British Academy report a couple of years ago about TRS, and there was the British Association for the Study of Religion produced a response to that last year that got lots and lots of discussion. And one of the things that they tackled in that report was the difference between theology degrees and religious studies degrees. And they argued that religious studies degrees were the future. I don't think that's an unfair way of summarizing this, but we're going to be increasingly popular. Theology is a very traditional way of thinking about this subject, but theology, as I would describe it, is about locating yourself within a particular religious tradition. Answering things like, if I were a Christian, how would I answer this question? Or if I were a Muslim, how would I answer this question? That gives a real challenge to students. I think I often, when we've got an open day, we've got people coming, I say, on this degree, you will be challenged to think yourself inside a whole bunch of different worldviews. Some of them might be yours, some of them won't be. You'll be trying to work out, if I was an atheist in the 19th century, how might I think about this problem? Or if I were a medieval Muslim trying to work out this, how might I think about that problem? But you've also got a lot of other disciplines that don't in any way try to encourage that, that say, We're trying to study religion as just a part of life, like any other part of life. You're not trying to take on any of the assumptions of a religious community. You're just saying, using the disciplines of history, of sociology, of cultural studies, of linguistics, whatever, what can we say about this part of life? And the way that departments are named, as you say, there's a lot of politics behind that, or there's a lot of tension about, is what we're doing here part of the tradition of theology, or is it actually a very different thing? Is it the study of religion, the critical study of religion, perhaps? Studying religion from the outside, or at least on a level with every other aspect of life.
Thank you. And bringing in Deborah Weston again here, and the training of teachers at universities, teacher training colleges within universities now, I think, largely, aren't they? What observations do you have about the links that there are between theology and religious studies at universities and those departments that are teaching teachers to teach religious studies?
There's two things there. First of all, there's a move towards more school-led teacher education. And so there isn't necessarily a link with the University Department of Education. So that's one aspect of it. The other, I guess, is to mention again the A-level, because one of the reasons for making amendments to the A-level pre-2016 was to make a better transition possible between A-level studies and colleges, teacher education, and of course theology and religious studies degrees. So rather than all the different options that there were in the A-level, lots of different combinations, and you could get an A-level religious studies with all sorts of different things, all students have got to study now for A-level 3 or 4 options, and they are study of one religion, religion and ethics, philosophy of religion, textual studies, and they have to study 3 or 4. So you can see how that would be a better preparation, hopefully, for people that want to go on to study religious ethics at university, want to study theology itself specifically, or one particular religion, and indeed philosophy of religion, or textual studies. So it gives a much better grounding, it is hoped, for that transition to university, and indeed then on to perhaps teacher training. But we don't get that many people go from theology and religious studies degrees into education, into teacher education. The last survey NATRE did on this came up with around 1,000 theology and religious studies graduates each year, of whom only 1 in 10 actually go into anything related to education. If I tell you the target for teacher training is around 600 every year, you can see 100 theology and religious studies degree people, possibly 600 people we need for secondary teacher education. Big gap.
Have you done any research on that? I mean, I don't know if any of our other panelists would like to suggest a reason as to why that should be. You'd have thought it would be higher. What else do you do with a theology and religious studies degree? Perhaps start there.
Over to you, Tim.
Well, so that's a softball question for a university admissions tutor, if ever there was. So there's an organisation called TRS UK, which has been working with Catherine's organisation and others to put together a series of videos about what people do with TRS degrees. They're really great videos. We should certainly post a link to them for everyone to watch. With theology and religious studies, you're learning a whole bunch of different skills. You're learning that very challenging task of putting yourself inside, like thinking in someone else's shoes, I guess. And that leads people on into careers in things like politics, policy, international relations, marketing often, all sorts of skills where empathy with others, trying to work out how someone else sees the world, are very, very important. You're also learning to tackle evidence and different sorts of evidence. So one thing I think is particularly interesting about a theology religious studies degree, you're learning to deal with evidence that's quite unreliable, often. Dubious, many thousands of year old, supposedly eyewitness accounts of something which sounds very unlikely. And you're trying to work out how to use those bits of evidence to figure out what historically might actually have gone on. That's very useful if you're going into law or journalism or any sort of storytelling profession like filmmaking. the range of different kinds of evidence that we tackle is really exciting in a theology and religious studies program. You're dealing with texts, but you're also dealing with ideas, you're dealing with history, you're working on sociology and surveys, you're analyzing art. So anything that involves that kind of research, like really broad research and bringing things together, and then presenting a persuasive argument. I talk to students about this as a complete education in one degree, because you're doing philosophy and you're doing history and you're doing social sciences and you're doing cultural studies and making sense of art in a really, really broad way. And of course, I think that's also true at A-level and at GCSE. So it's a degree that can lead on into all sorts of different ways. I think that there's a real challenge and opportunity for universities to strengthen our links with schools. So going back to the kinds of things Deborah has been talking about, the organisations like TRS UK have been trying to work to encourage schools, to encourage universities to be better at making links with schools and vice versa. I think a lot of school teachers just don't realise how eager their local university would be to be helpful to them. We know how important that, like getting people at GCSE to take A-level and getting people at A-level to consider a future university career, that's really important for us at universities. But we've also got loads and loads of subject specialists who would absolutely love to sit down with a class for a while and talk about climate change or gender and sexism and misogyny or race and racism and racialization, or all sorts of kind of the current issues of the moment as they apply to theology and religious studies. So it's always a great pleasure for me to get schools sending emails saying, hey, can you recommend a speaker? I'm like, yes, I can recommend many speakers who can be on your doorstep next week. But the challenge is how we get universities around the country to build up something that's a bit more organized than that. So we're contributing to serious teacher training to ensure that the teachers who are delivering the RE program or designing the RE curriculum in schools around the country are really well resourced and feel confident to do that.
Thank you. Could I bring in Katherine Wright here? Because I'm faced with the gap at the moment between people who are trained and have studied theology and religious studies and those teachers who find themselves having to teach it with no formal training. What can you, in your organisation, what can the profession do to close that gap?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Before I will answer your question, but just to say a great example this afternoon, later on this afternoon, I live near Cambridge, I'm going to Cambridge University, and it's a joint event being run between the Faculty of Divinity and the Faculty of Education. So they're bringing the two departments, if you like, together to provide an event for teachers. So they have a guest speaker, and so on. But I think that's a really good example of where university departments are working together, and I'm sure others are doing that as well. But I just thought I'd highlight that as that's happening today, and it's a positive example. So just to go back to your question about what do we do then with kind of this subject knowledge gap, I think there's a number of different things. One of the things which St Gabriel's and other organisations really lobbied for a few years ago was subject knowledge enhancement courses for those that are going into secondary teacher training. And there are, the government funds 8-week subject knowledge enhancement courses in religious education. And I think that's done quite a lot to encourage those that perhaps don't have a theology or religious studies degree to go into teacher training. So that's one thing. And we hope, obviously, that the government will continue to support subject knowledge enhancement courses. But organisations like ours and like NATRE and so on provide professional development for teachers. So we have a series of self-study courses which teachers can do. One of them is particularly for primary teachers who are just beginning perhaps their career and wanting to know more about how to teach religious education effectively. So we provide free self-study courses. We also have some work in development. We're developing an e-learning platform with courses which will be available from about May time this year. And then obviously we run events as well, professional development events, particularly linking back to what Tim was saying about universities connecting with teachers more. we run a series of events called In Conversations, where we bring researchers and teachers together, very much along the lines of a format we're in now. And in fact, Tim took part in one of those events earlier this term. You can listen to the recording on RE Online website. So I suppose we are doing all we can to equip teachers once they're in the profession and build and develop their subject knowledge going forward.
Thank you. I don't know who would like to take this question. It's from Ella Sen. Do you think that time is better spent preparing students in secondary school for life skills, such as handling taxes, their mental health, and becoming law-abiding citizens, rather than having such a large focus on RE?
First of all, there isn't a large focus on RE. Typically, the amount of time spent in secondary schools on RE is around an hour a week. That has been the case for quite some time, an hour out of the whole curriculum. And I think there's a risk in thinking about the curriculum as a sort of a collection of separate subjects. Each of the subjects, of course, has its own methodology and its own wealth of knowledge. However, it's interdependent. When you're learning about religious education, that supports your study of English literature, of music and art. And if you pull out one subject from a broad and balanced curriculum that we have, then you end up weakening everything. And again, those data lovers around there, well, I have evidence to show how, there is certainly a correlation between schools that or areas where they don't teach religious education very well and overall performance. Correlation, not necessarily causation, but at least there does seem to be a link. So I don't think it's an either or. I think we can put it all together.
Thank you, Deborah. And I'm delighted to say that we're joined now by Professor Douglas Davis from the University of Durham. I'm sorry, I know you've had terrible difficulties connecting, Douglas. We're relieved to see you there. We've been talking about religious education in schools and the kind of curriculum that students follow and how teachers are trained to teach RE. Can I ask you, from your perspective in your department at Durham University, when you meet students at the age of 18, what do you think they are expecting to study with you?
I think they're expecting a kind of tour of traditional world religions. I think they're expecting us to go through Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, whatever, and to do the kind of list of doctrines, practices, and that kind of thing.
But you've already started teaching worldviews at Durham, so what do you do instead?
We explain at the outset, and indeed I even have a lecture on what we're not doing. And the lecture on what we're not doing is the theology of religion, because I find that's the best way of putting it. Because by saying what we're not doing, we're able to explain that some studies of religion start from a confessional basis, whatever the tradition is, and then people go on to explain the rest. I suppose sometimes there's a problem because at some schools, there will be people teaching RE or the like with personal religious conviction, and either making that very explicit or have it as an implicit driver. So I try to make clear that we're not doing the confessional thing, that we're doing two things now, especially. We're providing a kind of a toolkit of theories, ideas, by which to understand human behavior that we often describe as religious or spiritual. And then we go on to look at this typology I've created of worldviews, trying to explain that each one of those gives a handle or a way of approach or a lens for looking at, and then we discuss what the at is going to be in there.
So could you just take us through what your thesis is in your book? What is this typology? What are the categories of worldviews that you outline in your book that you think will form a framework for teaching worldviews?
Yeah, I'll just list them and then I'll comment on them. That might be quite a good thing. We talk about the natural worldview, the scientific worldview, the ancestral worldview, the karmic worldview, the prophetic sectarian worldview, the mystical worldview, the ideological worldview, and the ludic worldview. And then we as it were, slot in, we explain what each one means, and then we slot things into it. So that, for example, yesterday we were doing the ludic, Latin, ludo, I play. So this is an approach which allows us to take things like the play of children, which we then link into attachment theories, because this is now becoming a significant thing in the study of religion, from the attachment theories of babies through to the attachment many of us feel as adults to our supernatural caregivers. So this changes the grammar of discourse a little bit. But then along with the ludic, we've got football. Now, students over the years have said, well, isn't football like religion? Oh, yes, it is. But instead of having to go into rather complex definitions of how it's different from the definitions of religion, we say, look, this is an example of the human being at play in large groups of people, singing, etc., engaging in what is meaningful in life to them. Because underlying all these worldviews is the idea of ethos and tone. How through these particular worldviews, we have an emotional meaning and attachment to things, which are helping us to helping gain us a sense of depth in life. Now, again, yesterday, for example, we were able to say, look, the Olympic Games is a very interesting example of the ritual, symbolic, ludic worldview. But now look with Ukraine, look what's just happened. This worldview, we can see how sport becomes a carrier institution for other messages. And this now is big with Ukraine. No footballing countries, judo belt taken away from the Russian president, all sorts of things. And it begins to show that from one little platform, you lead to another platform, as it were. So that would be the ludic one, but tied into there, then, and this comes from something we've been looking at throughout the module, we're then looking at what is research. Research is game playing, it's mind games. So from the little baby playing around to the scholar engaging in the study of a group, we are playing with ideas.
I've got one question with you, and then I'll bring, I'm sure the other panelists want to engage in a discussion with you. Now, my question is, these worldviews that lay underneath everything else, they could be secular, they could be religious. What place do they have in the study of religion?
The place they have is that the study of religion, as we pursue it here, is essentially an exploration of meaning making. The human animal in its evolution is a meaning making creature. We explore this psychologically and sociologically. And sometimes the way we do it is like this. The human animal is hardwired to speak. And every little baby learns to speak the language of its culture. We are, I think, hardwired for meaning making. And as we grow up, we take the resources of the culture we're in. Now, that could be what we would traditionally call a religious culture, or a secular culture, or a spiritual culture. In fact, what we're trying to do in this scheme is to overcome the distinction between religious and secular, or religious and spiritual. Because by looking at the issue of depth, you see, we start with the idea that the world is full of ideas. We become emotionally attached to some ideas, and that's what values are. Some of those values contribute to our sense of identity of who we are. And some of those we can describe as religious ideas, beliefs, or secular beliefs. And then a crucial thing comes in a kind of the Davis formula, which I start the whole lot off with, which is destiny. That everybody's happy to go up to the point of identity. Those who say I'm spiritual but not religious are really talking about their identity. What the traditional religions do is add the next step of destiny. Now, the destiny factor can either be afterlife, in paradise, in heaven, or in transmigration, for example, or the destiny can be in seeing your descendants. So the destiny factor can be either. But I think, and this is very helpful, then when you want to go and look at secularization, for example, that what secularization is the shrinking of the destiny factor, so that you can then say to students, look, in Britain today, probably Muslims, more than any other group, probably have a higher destiny factor of how you live and what happens to you afterwards than many other groups, because many Christian groups are pretty low on the afterlife business, but they're strong on this worldly ethics. One thing is always leading to another throughout the entire scheme.
Can I bring in Dr. Katherine Wright here, who has valiantly made a stab at reading your book, Douglas?
Katherine, well done. Thank you.
Yeah, Douglas, great to meet you virtually in this way. I suppose I've got loads of questions, having sort of dipped into your book, but I just wonder, particularly in relation to religious education in schools, I'm wondering whether what you're setting out in your book is primarily about a framing of content, if you like, the substantive knowledge, and or whether it's about an approach. One of the things that struck me towards right at the end of the book was where I felt you alluded more to kind of personal knowledge, if you like, and thinking more about how we are shaped and how we bring ourselves to what it is that we're studying. Perhaps some of us might say it's a hermeneutical approach, perhaps. So I was wondering whether you felt that what you'd set out was about kind of framing of content and or about an approach. I just sort of value your thoughts on that, really.
Definitely both. That certainly I want to frame content, and that's why early on we spend a great deal of time on things like gift theory, for example, just as an example, leading into ideas of merit, which immediately take you both into Eastern and Western traditions in different ways. Certainly content, but it seems to me that this kind of study almost inevitably leads to questions of identity and life commitment, life understanding. There's an existential factor to it. One has found this in generation after generation of students. And therefore, that final section, which is on seeing and seeing through, becomes important, because this seems to me to be the crux in terms of people who teach confessionally, or churches that teach quite properly confessionally, that the more scholarly information people generate, especially, well, either philosophically or social scientifically, and in the arts and humanities, I mean, literary criticism is much about it, the more people understand, the more they see through what they've been taught. They see that, oh, the vicar, the priest, the imam, they say this, and this. I don't believe that anymore. They see through it. And that's why I see that as a kind of we all grow up seeing by means of our culture. We talk by means of our culture. That's sort of step one. That's seeing, living through. Then we come to that second stage of seeing through it. We crunch it. We've got it. Now, some people, of course, never get to that point because they remain firmly dedicated, good Bible or Quranic believers or whatever they are, and that's that. But since we're dealing with this at education, this educational level at university or at schools to a degree, I suppose, people see through that. The world wasn't made in 6 days. I've got it. And then advance that to much more advanced philosophical, theological ideas. They've got it. Okay, what happens to you when you've got it then? That's the question. Do you now wring your hands in holy horror and say, I was betrayed? I once was asked to do a study of the Sea of Faith movement. I was invited to, and I did it. And one of the things that emerged from that was people who'd been dedicated Christians for much of their lives, who would come to a point where they weren't dedicated Christians to a self-existent deity anymore, but to a non-realist view of God. In other words, the divine things are products of the human imagination. Now, at that point, what kicks in there? Now, some of them saw it as betrayal, that the very institutions that exist to deal with the truth have sold me a lie. Now, this is the kind of seeing through that I've seen in small numbers of my own students for generation after generation. What happens when you see through it all? And that's when the issue of wisdom, if you like, or maturity, if you like. My mind goes back to one of my former PhD students who worked on Fowler's Stages of Faith. I haven't put that in the book, but it's in the back of my mind. You come to a point in life where, okay, you decide you're going to be British. Or just now, you might decide you don't want to be Russian and you want to leave. You want to be something else. That's one kind of response to existential self-awareness, to what I call in the book being human curious. We'll all be human curious. And if the curiosity comes to that point, when we see through it, what you do then? Well, you can decide to stay speaking English, or you can decide to stay being Anglican or Methodist or Muslim. But you're staying in a different way.
Thank you. Could I bring in Tim Hutchings at this point, please?
Hey, so thank you so much for that, Douglas. I want to actually go back to the question that we asked just before you joined us from Ella, I think, in the audience, who asked about preparing students for life skills. And I think what you're talking about here is life skills. It may not be as straightforward as how to handle your taxes, but these are life skills that a TRS degree or RE at GCSE and A-level prepares us for reflecting on who we are, as Douglas has been saying. It prepares us for understanding how everybody else around us in society, what motivates them, what do they think is their identity? What do they think makes them a lawful citizen? And you need theology and religious studies as part of your education, as part of just understanding what's going on in society around us, which is so important. There was a report, I don't know, Ruth, if you already did one of these events for journalists about the Islamophobia report from the University of Birmingham that came out quite recently, that's edited by Stephen Jones and Amy Unsworth. But just a month or so ago, a report came out about Islamophobia in Britain today, which argued that not only is Islamophobia incredibly common, but it's even more common among people with a university education. Increased levels of education cause people to be more prejudicial in unfounded and inaccurate ways. The idea that you can just give people an education in general, teach them maths and English or whatever it would be, and they'll be fine. It's not really true. You need RE, really good RE, and a theology and religious studies education, and some understanding of this kind of worldviews approach that Douglas is talking about, in order to combat really significant problems in our society today, like Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, religious nationalism, you could say, looking at this from another kind of angle. And it's the kind of things that we're trying to teach at school, at university, that are really essential for, I think, well-rounded citizens of the modern world.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Tim, because one of the things we do in the book is look at somebody who's never discussed in study of religion, really ever, and that's the sociologist Hans Moll, who developed a theory of the sacralization of identity. And the students really get into this. What is it about? It's about the things that are really important to me, I view as really important in themselves. It could be my favorite trainers. Don't touch my trainers, they're important for who I am. Don't touch my God, because he or she or it is important for who I am. And I find that this idea of the sacralization of identity, which goes along with the don't touch attitude, because I think that there are particular phrases that are really good in education. And a phrase like don't, keep off. In the everyday life world, who are you looking at? Keep off. And I try to show the students really that we can become so wedded to our beliefs and our practices and the communities that do them, that we say keep off. The obvious examples are things like depicting the prophet or saying things about Christ. Keep off. Why keep off? Because those symbols, those contents are what make me who I am. And then your point, Tim, is really important. You can then flip that coin and say, okay, these things are really important for you and your identity. They're really important for Muhammad and his identity, or whoever. And that, I think, really then leads to your point about the development of cultural awareness for being in the world with others. And I think that it's this issue of depth, of cultural depth, of existential depth, the who I am bit, which is back to meaning making, but meaning making with big roots in it, the emotions of our lives.
Can I just butt in there and bring in Deborah Weston? I'm just wondering, Deborah, how useful this understanding of worldviews is to the world of religious education and policymakers and teachers as you look to change the focus of religious education in schools. Is it relevant or helpful?
When the Commission on Religious Education reported in 2018, it proposed a statement of entitlement to religious education, which set out sort of a framework, if you like, for religious education and the selection of its content. And I was interested to hear what Douglas and Tim have said about this, because one of the areas of that was about ensuring children are prepared for life in a diverse world. And over the last few years, and since we've been campaigning to have greater understanding of this approach, we've been really pleased that one of the groups that have really taken a lot of interest in our work have been businesses, because it seems that businesses really recognise that for their employees and for them as employers, people really need to have a really good understanding of religion and worldviews. So that's quite a reality check. And in contrast, perhaps, to some of the things we hear from policymakers, which is, well, we don't think the public care about religious education anymore. Religion isn't really relevant in the world anymore. Pew Research shows that 85% of the world's population affiliate to a religion. So, we have to not lose sight of the fact that we're educating people for the global stage. And without wishing to bounce Katherine, I'd really like to get Katherine to say a little bit more about what we found out on our on the research into public perception in RE, because some of those figures, I think, are really worth understanding. Katherine, I don't know if I could just bounce you into talking about the survey a bit more.
Yeah, fortunately, I had a few stats to hand just in case, as I do. Yeah, on our Comes to Gabriel's website, I'll try and pop a link in the chat. You can find out a bit more about this. But I think the first thing I would say, just linking back to this whole question around diversity and how we are framing perhaps religious education going forward in terms of religion and worldviews, is that the general public, over 2/3, thought that having an understanding of diversity of worldviews was really important. So they were saying, well, they were agreeing basically with our definition of religious education, which I referenced right at the start of this session at lunchtime, and saying that actually, yes, they thought that was really important. And it was really important in a whole load of different contexts. So in contexts like in everyday life, as Deborah said, in the workplace, in schools, and even the majority, so over 50%, felt it was important to have this understanding in local and national government as well. So I think clearly the public are, in this sample, the public are clearly very supportive. Don't want to make too many generalisations, but I think it shows that perhaps previous surveys that have been conducted, where there's perhaps been not such a clear understanding of what religious education today is trying to do, we've kind of turned that bit on its head, and the general public perhaps are more positive than we think.
Can I bring in a question in the chat box about faith schools? We've been talking largely about state provision, I think, but what about schools, faith schools or independent schools that the question says independent faith schools that consistently fail Ofsted investigations and only focus on teaching their own faith? Are you concerned about the provision of religious education in faith schools? And how would the introduction of a worldviews approach affect the teaching of religion in faith schools? I don't know if anyone would like to pick up that question.
This is not my area of expertise at all, and there are obviously the right authorities who would investigate these matters very clearly. But I think what I would say is that the Religious Education Council, of whom I'm also a member of the board, fully support the recommendations that are in the Commission and RE report, and the statement of entitlement, the proposed statement of entitlement that Deborah mentioned earlier. And there are a number of organisations within the who are members of the RE Council who come from a whole range of different religious and non-religious worldviews. So I think in answer to the question, I think we need to let the authorities and so on deal with these matters. But I think what we've stressed at lunchtime today is that in general terms, people think that understanding one another, that mutual understanding that we each come from a position, our own worldview, which I always say, it's our own worldviews are in transition. I think that's a key sort of takeaway from today, that actually that's really important. But we should perhaps leave the authorities to sort out whether people are not complying or doing as they're told, if you like.
Thank you. I know we're coming to the end of the hour, but I would like to ask a question of you, Douglas. So we often say that journalists are on a kind of parallel path to teachers and educators, because journalists who write about religion are trying to explain religion to the public in the same way that teachers are trying to explain religion to students of whatever age. I just wonder what lessons there are in your book about the reframing of the study of religion and worldviews that would apply to journalists. Because we're the Religion Media Centre, right? And a lot of our work is reporting on traditional religious organisations or leaders of different groups. We wouldn't really write about your kind of game theory or sport theory. It wouldn't really make the front page of the paper. What tips or changes do you think that your understanding of the way religion is thought about should make to the way the media treats religion?
In a sentence, I would say we need to understand the relationship between the soundbite and the deep structure. Now, I've dealt with the media a lot over my lifetime, one way and another, and you know as well as I do that journalists like a professor to say something, which actually anybody could say, but they like the soundbite to come from a certain voice. Okay, that's a bit patronizing. But I think that it's trying to get to look beneath the surface. It's the vox pop that can both be the blessing and the curse of journalism. That it goes into short space. Sometimes somebody in the street says something absolutely brilliant, and sometimes it's so boring it's not worth the effort. And I suppose the journalist is the filter between the two. It's trying to get, if we could get, and this book of mine is utterly exploratory. And I've said to my own students, you show that these 10 categories are hopeless and put another 3 in their stead, or 14, great. This is to get things going. But to see knowledge as an iceberg, and religion is certainly an iceberg, that you see the rites and the practices and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Dalai Lama above the sea, and you don't see the 7/8 that's subterraneous or submarine, we might say. So that's the way I would take it. But I can see that it's a constant problem for journalism. Space and depth.
If I've got to try to find a kind of soundbite to sum up your book, Douglas, which I think is quite hard actually, because it's very long and very profound and very deep, as you say. Would a soundbite about your book be worldviews is about what lies underneath religious organizations?
That would do. But you will have noticed that I've entitled it Worldview Religious Studies. That's utterly intentional, simply to be a catalytic of the kind of discussion we've very interestingly we've had here. I think that point about diversity is important. I mean, one of the categories is the ideological worldview, and into that we've put things like human rights, like conspiracy theories, like LGBT, etc. situations, that the usefulness of having a category is to bring things together to see why lesbian and gay and trans issues are like issues of human rights, for example, or communism. We've got that in there as well, including its expansionist nature. It couldn't have been more timely than just now. You know, why on earth is communism in its current leadership in Russia like LGBT phenomena? Now, if you put that to students, there's a shock horror. What? How can they be the same? And I've had them to read in detail recently both the Communist Manifesto and the Statement on Human Rights. Sorry, I'm waffling now, but I think just having those boxes to put things in, I think could be quite useful for journalists, because they can ask themselves, what on earth has that got to do with that? In the same way that in the natural worldview, we've put ecology and environmentalism alongside Shinto and shamanism. Now, I don't think anybody's ever done that before. And at least it should prompt people to say, how on earth can you link some aspects of contemporary Japanese stuff with, do you know what I mean? It's the mind shaking bit that I've been concerned with in all this.
Mind shaping. I like it. That'll do as a headline there, Douglas. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part, and hope to see you all at our media briefing next week. But meanwhile, thanks a lot, and stay safe, everyone.